Alright, so we're going to review the midterm here and see what we can land. We're going to start off with Of Mice and Men, and we're going to start off with the true-false. Remember that in this story, Lenny, when basically he kills the puppy and Curly's wife finds him, he blames the puppy for the death, not Curly's wife. And George tells Lenny about the farm before shooting him at the end of the novel. Now, when they go to see the boss, George does tell Lenny to keep quiet before they meet the boss because he's worried they'll not get the job. In the bunkhouse, Candy is, Carlson wants to shoot his dog, but Candy doesn't ask him to shoot the dog. This is something that Carlson essentially pushes and eventually gets his way with. In the final acts of the novel, Slim is the only one who truly does understand George and why he had to kill Lenny and why he's upset by it. Slim, of course, is highly regarded on the ranch by the workers, and his job is a jerkline skinner, and his job also is to drive mules. Lenny and George, even though George tells the boss that they're cousins, they are not cousins. George plans to buy the ranch someday and allows Candy to come in on the dream because Candy's the one who possesses the money to help put down on their dream. Lenny was never aggressive, and he never took his frustrations out on anything. He just simply didn't know his own strength. Basically, what Lenny tells George is primarily, if there's any trouble, hide in the brush. And that's basically at the end of the story what ends up happening. George ends up killing Lenny with Carlson's gun, not a shotgun. And the men joke about Curly because he wears a glove full of Vaseline on his hand that he's supposed to keep his hand soft for his wife. Candy's afraid, though, at the beginning of this story and when he's in the bunkhouse that he's going to be fired because he's gotten old and they no longer, want to employ him. Curly does not like Lenny, though, because ultimately he's a large guy. And because he's a bigger guy, he likes to fight, so he likes fighting the bigger guys. Lenny and Curly are in the barn, but the men are tossing horseshoes outside, which is why they're alone. Curly's wife, when she's with Lenny, wants to know what happened to Curly's hand. And George and Lenny, at the beginning of the novel, leave weed because Lenny frightened a young girl by grabbing onto her dress or wanting to touch her dress. After learning of the murder, though, George basically gives up the dream. In the last chapter, Lenny has like a psychological breakdown, and he starts dreaming about Aunt Clara, but he also dreams about a giant rabbit that he talks to. Let's see, a motif. Remember that a motif is a reoccurring theme, like a subject or an idea or something that's over and over again, like living off the fat of the land. An allusion is something that's like a figure of speech that makes an allusion or a reference to maybe a story or event or a person who's in history. Moving on to The Crucible. At the beginning of the year, we read a novel called The Crucible. And some of the things that happen is Thomas Putnam, who's like one of the rich landowners, is very vindictive and spiteful in the story. Reverend Paris is another one of those who's very similar. He's reluctant or hesitant to tell anyone that Betty may be bewitched because he's afraid of his reputation and getting fired or having his enemies destroy him. The villagers view Rebecca Nurse as a kind and respectable woman who's very pious. Abigail, though, who is the niece of Reverend Paris, goes into the forest because she's wanting to get rid of Goody Proctor by having her make a charm to get rid of her so she can have John Proctor as her own. We can infer or assume that the people of Salem thought dancing was evil and sinful based on the way they reacted. Looking at Tituba, she most likely confesses to meeting the devil because primarily she doesn't want to die. She's going to save her life. John Proctor can probably best be described as somebody who rebels against authority and speaks his own mind, as he does in The Village. And Rebecca advises Paris to send Reverend Hale away. She's afraid that, his presence would only cause more hysteria and issues in Salem. Elizabeth urges John in Act 2 to basically go to the court and tell Abby's story of being a lie or a hoax. And people in the village, they part like the Red Seas for Abigail because they fear her power to accuse them and thus being arrested. Reverend Hale begins to worry about the validity, that's the witch trials being actually valid, in Act 2, because perhaps maybe innocent people are being accused, and some of the best are being accused. Sarah Good is accused of witchcraft because she could not recite her 10 Commandments. And Mary Warren, of course, enjoys her role in the court because it gives her power that she's never known before and status in the village. And Mary Warren says she can't tell the truth in court because she fears Abigail. Moving into Goody Osborne, she'll hang and Sarah Good won't because Sarah Good has confessed. In Act 3, the mood is set. It is sad and dispirited. But more importantly, though, the thing about Act 3, the detail setting the mood makes it gloomy and forbidding. Even though people are sad or whatever, they're also angry and upset and afraid. But the setting itself is gloomy and forbidding. When Abigail says, "Think you might be so mighty that the power of hell may not turn your wits, beware of it," she's basically threatening Danforth using her power. Elizabeth Proctor doesn't tell Danforth that Abigail's a harlot because she's afraid for John. She wants to save John's reputation. Moving on to The Devil and Tom Walker, an important condition of the Tom's deal with Old Scratch that's not directly ever stated is, he'll lose his soul because Old Scratch is the devil. After Tom makes the deal with Old Scratch, his name is most probably recorded in that forest on the trees. Early in the story, the narrator says Tom takes the skull and sees it in the swamp. This pretty much indicates that Tom is in an old Indian battleground that had long since been abandoned. And Old Scratch doesn't frighten Tom too much because, as bad as Old Scratch is, his wife is worse. The proof of the statement of Old Scratch is, to prove that he was there, is he puts the mark, that finger on Tom's forehead. And the relationship between Tom and his wife are more like cats and dogs, which they fight. And Tom's wife probably most likely disappears because she's taken after trying to bargain with Old Scratch. She wasn't having her way. The most authentic account of the disappearance of Tom's wife pretty much has like her heart and liver tied up in her apron. The disappearance of Tom's wife makes him feel really grateful and happy to Old Scratch because now he doesn't have to deal with her anymore. In negotiating their deal, Tom rejects the idea of becoming a slave trader. It's the only positive thing you could say about Tom's character that works for him. Let's see. Frederick Douglass. He's the most highly placed that you could be on Colonel Lloyd's plantation if you're a slave. The best job you could have primarily is working on the boat or sloop. It's the only time you get to actually get out of the plantation. Slave infants were most often cared for by older slave women too old to work the field. And when Douglass goes to Baltimore, when his mistress refuses to teach him to read, she teaches him the ABCs, but not how to read, he turns to the little boys in the street. Colonel Lloyd's plantation was the central location of the clerk and the superintendent and the seat of government for 20 farms. And slave owners did not desire their slaves to learn to read or write. Douglass had 2 sisters and a brother, but they were never really close since they didn't meet each other. And at the death of his master and next his daughter Lucretia, the greatest single injustice done to Douglass was his grandmother. At 7 or 8 years old, Douglass was sent to live with the Alds in Baltimore, and his mother's name was Harriet Bailey. The moment of epiphany, that's the moment of realization after Douglass's fight with Covey, was that Douglass remained a slave only 4 years afterwards. In the general time frame, slaves could reveal their birthday is in the planting time or the harvest time. Douglass punishes his master for taking away the privilege of hiring him out by simply not working anymore. He refuses to work. Douglass was 21 when he was finally a free man, and his duties in Baltimore was basically taking care of Master Thomas, Ald's son. The first severe whipping by Mr. Covey was because he couldn't drive an oxen and cart. And the first time he was advised to run away and seek the aid of abolitionists, he was talking to a pair of Irishmen and helped them unload stone. Douglas would practice writing in Thomas's used books, copy books, and that's how he learned how to write. And during the course of the novel, Douglas shows how he is reduced from defiance to submission, but then what ends up happening is he ends up moving from fear to defiance, and that's what you want to know, is that he was originally afraid and then eventually became defiant, and that was how he is able to gain his freedom. The wretchedness of a slave is most determined by their hunger or their lack of shelter and clothing. Most of the time, though, their wretchedness is by their lack of shelter and clothing, not the hunger. But I would venture to say that when Douglas looked at the white sails on the Chesapeake Bay, he mourned them because they were free from slavery. Douglas walks to Master Thomas's store to seek help. In the event that he was forced to watch the blood-stained gate, the entrance to slavery was the whipping of his aunt. His fellow slave advises Douglas to carry a root with him. He says that will protect him from being whipped by any white man. And the trade that Douglas learned, the job, was learning how to be a caulker. The nickname Covey was given by the slaves was the Snake. And Douglas's knowledge of his father, what he knew about him it was said that he was basically his master and that he was white. Moving on, Douglas believes religious slaveholders to be more cruel, and the extended metaphor that when Covey and Douglas are fighting, used to represent the change in Douglas where he becomes a fighter again and he gets his freedom, is that it was like a rebirth for him and a resurrection. He had been broken and destroyed, and by fighting back with Covey, he had been reborn again. And it was never a common practice for children to stay with their parents growing up as slaves. They were always separated from them. And Douglas believed that the pathway of slavery to freedom was literacy. In The Minister's Black Veil, which is a parable, the word parable tells us or teaches us a message, which in this case was people wear masks. The meaning of Mr. Hooper's veil, basically between people, is never really complete or clear, but what we can infer, this is predict or determine about Elizabeth when she asks him to remove the veil, is she's angry with him for wearing the veil. She doesn't support his decision at all, and she doesn't even understand the truth, but ultimately she is angry with him for wearing it. The Puritan attitude towards human nature basically is people ultimately are pessimistic. Okay, they're pessimistic, look on the negative side of things. And the person who comes back and helps Mr. Hooper and takes care of him is Elizabeth. The moral lesson of this is guilty secrets separate us from one another, always. And that the parishioners have such an intense response to seeing the veil, they're frightened by it. They're absolutely frightened by it. The members of the church, when they see his veil, these people felt like, they thought that the veil was simply awful. And the group that the veiled minister seems to have the most power over is his congregation, his people who follow him. And the central theme, basically, to this story is that people with faith can overcome any hardship, regardless of their sin, if they just pray and they believe. The message about human nature that is most strong in Elizabeth's nursing of Mr. Hooper is love for someone will always endure despite what that person does. The black veil primarily symbolizes secret sin. That's it. I wish you the very best of luck to your assessment and your midterm. And then have a great Christmas.